You know, we talk about the First Amendment, the United States Constitution, and for the purposes of what we're about to talk about here, we talk about the Establishment Clause, which states that the government is prohibited from making any laws, quote, respecting the establishment of religion. Now, that has been battered back and forth for decades, including in the 60s when the United States Supreme Court weighed in and said that particular constitutional provision speaks for itself. So today we're hearing that President Trump wants to protect prayer in public schools. He delivered remarks today at the Museum of the Bible in Washington while addressing the White House Religious Liberty Commission.
I'm pleased to announce this morning that the Department of Education will soon issue new guidance protecting the right to prayer in our public schools.
He said that he created the Department of Justice task force to eradicate anti-Christian bias.
For most of our country's history, the Bible was found in every classroom in the nation. Yet in many schools today, students are instead indoctrinated with anti-religious propaganda, and some are even punished for their religious beliefs.
I think one of the issues, too, is you have to, first of all, acknowledge that any student who's ever gone to school prays in school. If they are a praying person, if they've got a test, they're probably praying, right?
That's true.
But we're talking about public prayer in school, and I was trying to think if I had prayer in school classes, and I didn't start school until about 1970, but I don't remember that. But I do remember that we could be paddled in the principal's office or even by a teacher, but I don't remember praying.
No, I don't remember praying in school unless you took a LDS Institute class or whatever else was being offered.
Off campus,
seminary,
that's off campus,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, but that was separate from the school. And, you know, we also have to consider this, that if you're talking about religion, what Trump's talking about is the Bible and Christianity. Of course, that's focused in a particular group. But if you're going to have some procedure like that where there's prayer in school, I think you've got to make sure that, unless you want to violate the First Amendment, that you've got to make it open to any.
Right. I think especially the conversation, the conversation about religious liberty, that it applies to all. And so a question that I had for you is, does this mean that people who are Muslim, will they be able to start bringing prayer rugs into school, and will they have an opportunity to pray at school as they desire?
And you can bet that the United States Supreme Court is going to address that. I mean, that's. I don't think you can open it to one and not the other. I mean, obviously you cannot under our Constitution and under our laws that have been supported by the United States Supreme Court. Trump is obviously talking to his base, and I appreciate that, his Christian base. And so he's directing his remarks exclusively to Christianity. But in terms of him and his Department of Justice, you know, creating a task force to do certain things, you've got to make sure that it's open to all religions, or you're going to get shut down. And you may not be able to do it at all with the Establishment Clause, but I mean, certainly you can't exclude or certain religious groups.
We do have a texter who had this comment. I thought President Trump abolished the Department of Education, so why is he now giving them orders?
That's true. He's actually seemingly doing it again he's creating the Department of Justice to eradicate anti-Christian bias. In other words, prosecute it criminally, perhaps, or at least to look at some other remedy for anti-Christian bias. I don't know what that would mean outside of criminal prosecution if you're talking about having your Department of Justice look into it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Look, one of the things that the President Trump has said is that he was speaking, and I think you said this at a Museum of the Bible at an event there. But for most of our country's history, he said the Bible was found in the classroom. But we have states now across the country that are saying we're going to have the Bible as a text. We're going to consider it a historical text, but we're also going to have 10 Commandments up on the walls of our schools. So Arkansas and Texas and Louisiana have laws now that require the 10 Commandments be displayed at school, although there's legal challenges to those as well.
Yeah, and there has to be. I mean, whether you agree with it or not. And, of course, you know, most of us were raised in a Christian household and with Christian beliefs, but that's not the same for all of the country anymore. And it's certainly the numbers of non-Christian religious groups in our country have increased daily and will continue to.
So I think the separation of church and state, and you mentioned this, right? But that people conflate the practice of religion with government, right? If government has anything to say at all. And for me, my understanding has always been that the government will not create a state religion. So if you look, for example, at England, they have the Church of England. That is a state religion, right? Where the church and the state go together. And of course, you go back in history, and the leaders of the church and the leaders of the country were intimately tied together. But in this situation, back to the founding fathers, there were several who were like, look, I don't want to impose a religion on this country in general. And I think that's wise, right? I think that people should be free to practice or not practice the religion of their choice. And that means, as you start to look at how does this apply in a classroom? Well, if you're going to have prayer in the classroom, you have to allow every religion. And I think it's the Church of Satan. They, like, every time there's a conversation like this, they're like, great, we're going to be there.
Yeah, and speaking at the Museum of the Bible in Washington, Trump said that he will defend the nation's Judeo-Christian principles with vigor.
When faith gets weaker, our country seems to get weaker. When faith gets stronger, as it is right now, we're having a very good period of time. After some rough years, good things happen for our country.
I think religion does mean good things happen for our country, right? But look, there's lots of research when we've talked about it on this show, but there's lots of research about religious nuns, and when you hear it, it sounds like you're talking about Catholic women, N-U-N-S, but it's N-O-N-E-S, people who don't have a religious affiliation, but many of them still feel like they have a spiritual life, right? And that they have spiritual grounding. And that's where you start to get in. We're not going to prescribe what you practice. And so if you start to have in classrooms, are you going to start to pray where you've got this rise of religious nuns with no religious affiliation? What about those people who are raising their children to believe in maybe a higher power, but there's nobody that they pray to?
Yeah, Trump doesn't seem to have any guardrails when it comes to certain things like religion, and I don't mean that facetiously, but he's clearly talking about a specific religion.
Yeah,
he's talking about it, Christianity. He's talking about the Bible. He's
and
talking
Judaism, I think.
And I think he would do well to keep it as neutral as possible. You know, if you want to bring more religion into the classroom, that's a great idea. I mean, I think he's got to be careful about just opening up to all religions.
So we have News Nation's White House correspondent Kellie Meyer on for just a couple of minutes. Kellie, what can you give us as far as an update on this most recent speech by President Trump?
Yeah, hey there. Thanks for having me. So the president, he's now back at the White House after giving this rare speech really around the corner at the Museum of the Bible, and he really used it to highlight what he says is his administration bringing the country closer to faith during the first 8 months of his administration. He talked about what he's done in those first 8 months. For example, he said slashing federal funding for any schools that teach transgender education. He talked about banning gender-affirming surgeries and banning men from competing in women's sports. These are all things that Democrats have pushed back on and continue to push back on. But he talked about how these actions are bringing faith back into the country. And he did talk about the next step for his administration, giving this guidance to the Department of Education, where they will issue new guidance to, quote, protect the right to prayer in our public schools. And he also used the moment to really talk about what they're going to do ahead of the 250th birthday celebration for the country. He launched this America Prays initiative. So what they want to see, a White House official tells us that they want to see Americans dedicate time every week to prayer in the country. So a major focus for this administration on faith and what that means in the year ahead.
Yeah, so we're talking about the 250th anniversary of country, which is
the
coming
founding
up.
Of
Yeah,
the country next
coming
year.
Up. Yeah, next year, and he's talking about doing some things in anticipation of that. Is that correct, Kellie?
Yeah, exactly. So it would be that initiative to launch this, what they're calling, quote, America Prays, and that's to encourage Americans to pray for the country, dedicate a certain time each week to do that. So really just trying to emphasize the role of faith and bringing that back into both the discussion over government and the country, and really bringing faith back into the picture, according to the White House, is what they're working to do. He also talked about bringing his own Bible, his family Bible, to the museum today. It was something that was used in his inaugurations, both of his inaugurations, and that will be on display at the museum. So really trying to show that this administration is bringing faith, or has been, into the focus, even though some of the positions, the policies that have been unveiled in the last 8 months have been pushed back on by many Democrats and other Americans in the country as potentially going too far in some ways.
I have one really quick final question before we let you go, Kellie. What about religions that are not Christian-based or Jewish?
Yeah, and it didn't seem like there was a lot of discussion around that. They talked a lot about the initiatives that the administration has been taking to fight anti-Semitism. He spoke about the shooting at Annunciation Catholic School and what the administration may do going forward, though we don't know any kind of congressional action that may be taken, if any. But it did seem like a focus really on both Christian faith as well as protecting the Jewish faith against anti-Semitic action.
Thank you for joining us. We'll be right back.